another episode of our show within a show called Dimwits, Dipshots, and Dufuses and Dullards. And I say dipshots because, YouTube doesn't like swear words within the first 2 minutes of an episode. So there's a little bit of self censorship happening. And it almost seems to match today's theme in the episode, which is about dictators aplenty. You know, it's, a common phenomenon for dictatorial slash authoritarian regimes or social settings to say that you have to censor offensive language and whatnot. So that's not to say that all censorship is equally as egregious or offensive, but it's a sign that there are some tendencies that are not perfect. And I'm gonna get into that a little bit more the further I get along here. So to start us off, I'm gonna note that during a recent meeting with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, I think I'm pronouncing that name correctly. But anyway, apparently this happened at the White House. President Trump expressed confidence in Russian President Vladimir Putin's commitment to uphold a potential peace agreement to end Russia's 3 year invasion of Ukraine. Trump emphasized his belief in Putin's reliability, stating that their long-standing relationship bolsters his trust in the Russian leader's promises. So, according to Trump, Vladimir Putin's trustworthy now. So, how about that? Hmm. Well, this assertion comes in the context of ongoing peace negotiations involving Russia, Ukraine, and European leaders. Prime Minister Starmer has advocated for U.S. support in providing security guarantees for European nations participating in potential peacekeeping missions in Ukraine, despite European allies' apprehensions regarding Trump's negotiation strategies and possible concessions to Russia. The discussions aim to establish a lasting resolution to the conflict. I guess we'll see how that works out. So, Trump's confidence in Putin is informed, wink, by his experience during what he calls the Russia hoax investigation early in his first term. The investigation, led by a special counsel, scrutinized the FBI's probe into Russian interference in the 2016 US presidential election. Trump has consistently dismissed the investigation's findings, perceiving them as a baseless attack on his administration. Well, publicly perceiving them anyway. Of course, we don't really know what goes on in his orange tinted noggin, but we just have to take him at his word. I, I couldn't even say that without laughing. Anyway, this perspective has seemingly reinforced his trust in Putin, who is, just such a trustworthy guy, as he believes both leaders were unjustly targeted by unfounded allegations. Hmm, you mean like the allegation that you launched an invasion into a different country? That sort of allegation? That seems to be backed up by significant evidence. But from my standpoint, skepticism toward state actors and their proclaimed intentions is paramount. Historically, agreements between nation states have often been influenced by power dynamics and interest. Imagine that. Sometimes at the expense of marginalized populations. And no, in this case, I don't just mean, specific groups. I mean, like, the majority of the population, which is marginalized under a dictatorial government. In the context of US Russia relations, both governments have engaged in actions that prioritize their geopolitical interests, occasionally leading to the suppression of dissenting voices and the perpetuation of systemic inequalities. The relationship between Trump and Putin has been characterized by a series of diplomatic engagements and public statements that suggest a mutual affinity. Critics, like myself, argue that this rapport may embolden authoritarian tendencies and undermine democratic institutions. For instance, Trump's recent characterization of Ukrainian President Zelensky as a dictator for suspending elections during the ongoing conflict has sparked controversy. Zelensky, in response, expressed willingness to resign if Ukraine receives security guarantees or NATO membership, highlighting the complex interplay of power and governance in wartime. I mean, it's kind of weird to criticize him as a dictator when, you know, presumably the reasons that the elections were suspended was because they're under attack. Like, that's that there's evidence of that. That's not just some flimsy excuse. And it's also weird, when a person is called a dictator by some people who either already are dictators or are aspiring to have dictatorial powers. And it's firmly established fact that the United States and especially Donald Trump has a long-standing relationship with Saudi Arabia and other dictatorial areas, and you know they don't often get criticized for being dictators over there anyway. So, this seems like a little bit of selective outrage that is strategic in nature and really see-through. The tricky thing is, you can't really have an election if you're being constantly attacked by a very powerful neighboring state. How are you going to smoothly have elections if you're literally basically forced to defend yourself like on a near constant basis, right? So some critics will say, "Oh, you're defending the lack of elections or whatever," but some things are very tricky. It's like if you're trying to do something during a natural disaster, like you can't necessarily have society function normally if there's a tornado outbreak in your neighborhood. You might have to cancel plans at that time. This is roughly parallel in the destructive element to a natural disaster. Anyway, the most worthwhile critiques of these types of governments often emphasize the dangers of centralized power and the potential for state actors to engage in coercive practices. The current geopolitical landscape, marked by negotiations between powerful nation states, may sideline any grassroots movements and the voices of those directly affected by conflict. Furthermore, the focus on high level agreements can obscure systemic issues that contribute to war and oppression, such as economic disparities, nationalism, and militarism. So, in light of these considerations, it's valuable to critically assess narratives presented by state leaders and to amplify perspectives of those communities directly impacted by geopolitical decisions. While diplomatic efforts to end conflicts are necessary, this should not come at the cost of perpetuating existing illegitimate power structures or marginalizing dissenting voices. My perspective advocates for a more decentralized and egalitarian approach to conflict resolution, one that prioritizes the needs and autonomy of all individuals involved over the interests of the more powerful elites. So, as the situation continues to evolve, or de-evolve, if you want to put it like that. It remains crucial to remain vigilant and question the motivations behind state actions. Engaging with diverse perspectives, particularly those from grassroots organizations and affected communities, can provide a more comprehensive understanding of the complexities inherent in international relations and peace negotiations. All right, so that's my little critique of the situation between Putin and Saudi Arabia. Basic, or not Saudi Arabia, look at me. Uh, the United States, which actually seems to be in the pocket of Saudi Arabia. Whoops, maybe that was a Freudian slip. So, yeah, there's a lot of nuance that could be brought to the table here, but really the most powerful states, they don't really care about nuance. They don't really care that much about, you know, uh, forfeiting any powers. They just want to have more and more power for themselves. They don't want the population to have more of a, of a slice of the pie. So there's another segment to my show. I've actually got three segments to this Dimwits, Dipshits, Doofuses, and Dullards show within a show. And the second one is called Peripheral Poophead of the Week. So this week's selection is Kim Jong Un. Kim Jong Un, born on January 8th, with reported birth years ranging from 1982 to 1984, is the third son of Kim Jong il and grandson of North Korea's founder, Kim Il sung. Assuming leadership after his father's death in December 2011, Kim Jong un has maintained and intensified the totalitarian regime established by his predecessors. So, he's keeping the family business going, I guess you could say. Educated in Switzerland under pseudonyms, Kim Jong un was exposed to Western culture during his formative years, which is a little bit ironic because, from what I understand, the population in general is not supposed to be exposed to Western culture, you know, during their formative years or at any other point. The the outside world is largely kept the outside world. And despite his exposure to Western culture, his leadership in North Korea has been marked by strict control and severe human rights abuses. So it's like he saw some of the relatively good elements of Western culture, and he's like, we can't have those. So the government employs threats of torture, executions, imprisonment, and forced disappearances, and forced labor to maintain control over its populace. And some people here in the United States see those types of behavior, and they're like, you know what? Let's do that over here too. We can learn from each other. And in North Korea, basic freedoms, including expression, association, and religion, are systemically denied, with independent media, civil society organizations, and trade unions being banned. So that's interesting. That they call themselves a socialist country, yet they ban trade unions. That's a little bit wacky. I mean, you can correct me on that if I got the incorrect information, but it sounds like individual trade unions are banned, and pretty much everything is channeled through the dictatorship, and that's according to Human Rights Watch, which is a pretty solid organization that lives up to its title. They watch the situations in various countries and make sure that their human rights are not being violated, the populations of these countries. Under Kim's rule, North Korea has expanded its nuclear weapons program, leading to heightened tensions internationally. Although, on that note, I do have to say that if you're going to have various governments that have nuclear weapons, it kind of makes sense that they're going to want to be able to defend themselves. So the international tensions are not just the result of North Korea, of course. The policy of Byung-jin, reminiscent of Kim Il sung's approach in the 1960s, emphasizes the simultaneous development of the economy and nuclear capabilities. This strategy has often been pursued at the expense of the general populace's well being, with resources diverted from essential services to military endeavors. Ah, isn't that nice? See now that's something, you know, Kim might have saw from the United States. It was like, yes, let's divert the essential services resources over to these military endeavors. I'm going to take a drink of water now. So, that hit the spot. Anyway, the regime's oppressive measures extend to the use of forced labor, which has become deeply institutionalized. Reports indicate that North Korean workers are subjected to harsh conditions, both domestically and abroad, with their wages often confiscated by the state. This practice not only violates international labor standards, but also serves as a means for the regime to generate revenue, potentially funding its prohibited weapons programs. So, in recent years, North Korean soldiers have been deployed under Russian command during the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So, they're teaming up. Testimonies from captured soldiers reveal severe conditions, including extreme cold, strict discipline, and significant casualties. Many of these soldiers were misled by their commanders and have expressed desires to defect, highlighting the regime's exploitation of its military personnel. And of course, the use of the military in authoritarian regimes is often one of the paramount things. They have military parades, and that was talk tough, and you know, mi- with a lot of militant talk, and it's like they just can't settle down. They can't calm down. It always has to be aggressive talk, against perceived enemies, and of course, the perceived enemies might include elements of the population itself. Of course, the regime's control over its citizens is further exemplified by the severe punishments imposed for using or disseminating South Korean style language as per a law enacted to curtail freedom of expression. Forced labor, as I mentioned already, including that involving children, continues unabated. Government policies have also contributed to ongoing food insecurity, and healthcare provisions remain inadequate. Arbitrary detention of government critics is appalling, and the conditions are appalling, and they persist, with concerns about the fate of North Koreans forcibly returned from abroad. And despite international condemnation, the regime maintains a tight grip on power through a pervasive cult of personality surrounding Kim Jong un. State media frequently refer to him with honorifics such as respected comrade Kim Jong un or Marshal Kim Jong un, reinforcing his authoritative image. This personality cult serves to legitimize his rule and suppress dissent within the country. And from my perspective, Kim Jong un's leadership exemplifies the dangers of concentrated power and the suppression of individual freedoms. The state's pervasive control over all aspects of life, coupled with its use of violence and coercion, stands in stark contrast to actual socialist principles advocating for decentralized, non hierarchical societies based on voluntary cooperation and mutual aid. So that's something people don't emphasize enough, that, these so called all powerful socialist states or communist states or whatever, they actually are not purely socialistic, because even under the teachings of Karl Marx, there is only supposed to be a transitional stage, and eventually, as Marx said himself, the state is actually supposed to wither away at a certain point. Well, when it comes to scenarios like this, there is no chance that the leader will wither away. Many in the population will wither away, but that's a different story. The experience of North Koreans underscore the profound human cost of authoritarian governments and the urgent need for systemic change to prioritize human dignity and autonomy. Kim Jong un's tenure as North Korea's leader has been characterized by intensified repression, human rights abuses, and aggressive military posturing. Again, something they're obsessed with, along with so many other, powerful nations around the planet. They have to, pose with their fun killer toys, because they're the big boys on the block or whatever. Every nation is number one. Every sports team is number one. Every every god is the greatest god. It's all the same shit. The regime's actions continue to draw international scrutiny and condemnation, highlighting the ongoing struggle for freedom and justice faced by the North Korean people, and of course, not just by the North Koreans, but anyone within the orbit of such a government. So, for the third segment, sticking with the North Korean thing, we're going to look at the fetid fever dream flashback of the week, which is the daddy, the Kim Jong Il of the North Korean leader. So Kim Jong Il, the former leader of North Korea, who is deceased, he did actually die at a certain point. He was not immortal, though I think he would have liked to have been immortal, and he certainly would have liked to have been seen as immortal. That's what surprises me about it. Like I'm actually surprised that they allowed the population to know that he was capable of dying. I guess that's one moderate aspect of North Korea, is that they actually do allow the population to think that its leaders are actually mortal human beings. So I guess that makes them relatively moderate. But anyway, Kim Jong Il was involved in numerous scandals, which is why this is a fever dream flashback, a fetid fever dream flashback. And that includes human rights abuses and general economic mismanagement and covert operations. One of the biggest and most internationally recognized scandals was the 1994 to 98 North Korean famine, which resulted in the deaths of an estimated 240,000 to even 3.5 million people due to starvation and related causes, probably untreated diseases and things like that. So, this crisis was largely a result of government policies, including agricultural mismanagement, rigid central planning, and a prioritization of military spending over civilian needs. See, that seems to be a regular theme that you know the, that I'm going to be mentioning, in this episode, as almost an overarching theme. It's almost like the the main thing that's uniting all of these powerful leaders together is that they prioritize the military spending over other forms that could better assist the general population. Another infamous scandal was North Korea's state sponsored criminal activities, which oddly enough, we don't really hear that much about. But apparently, there has been drug trafficking, counterfeiting US currency, and abductions of foreign nationals, particularly Japanese and South Korean citizens. At least, this is according to a lot of different sources. The regime also engaged in large scale weapons proliferation and illicit arms sales. So, for some reason, the international media, it seems to not emphasize those aspects as often, like the outright mobster elements of North Korea. It's so much, based on the quirky qualities of the leadership at the top, but you don't hear about the sort of mundane, uh, things like illicit arms deals and uh, kidnapping, apparently even counterfeiting currency, selling drugs like, lowly drug dealers and all that kind of stuff. So, my perspective on Kim Jong il's rule and his scandals: Kim Jong il's leadership exemplifies the worst excesses of authoritarian state power, where a centralized government operating without accountability sacrifices the well being of the people to maintain its own control. North Korea's political system is the antithesis of basic ideals such as freedom, really, as it is built on strict hierarchy, military dominance, and a cult of personality. And usually these personalities are always dog shit too, like they're not actually good people with good personalities. That's another theme that really needs to be emphasized. So of course another thing that should be focused on is the state monopoly on resources and the famine. I criticize centralized economic control, arguing that it leads to inefficiency, corruption, and mass suffering quite easily. That's not even to say it's guaranteed to happen, but often it does. And the North Korean famine was not just a natural disaster, but a failure of state planned agriculture and a refusal to allow local or decentralized food distribution. The state's rigid control over production and trade, combined with a refusal to seek foreign aid in a timely manner, turned what could have been a manageable crisis into a catastrophic one. You know? So, state sanctioned crime and coercion is pretty common in these scenarios. It's like you might say mother's milk or something like that. It's second nature. So I generally oppose, most forms of coercion, whether from government or corporations. They're often interlinked, and you know, quite often they're interlinked with crimes as well. The North Korean state engaged in large scale organized crime on that note, using its monopoly on violence to conduct illicit activities that harmed people globally. This mirrors how states often justify their existence as providing law and order, while simultaneously engaging in the very behaviors they claim to prevent, such as theft, violence, and fraud. Well, that reminds me of one of the sayings that's going around now with the preventing waste, fraud, and abuse stuff that certain people are bandying about, when in fact they are, the people talking about that are often the key perpetuators of waste, fraud, and abuse. So there's also a lack of individual freedom and suppression of dissent. Kim Jong il's regime was defined by absolute suppression of individual freedom. North Koreans were denied freedom of speech, movement, and association. Political prison camps functioned as tools of terror, and they still do, of course, but they ensured no opposition could rise, or they reasonably assured that. I'm sure there, I'm sure even in these societies there is probably more opposition than the population hears about, but it's suppressed so people don't hear about it. So in contrast, I advocate for more self governments, voluntary cooperation, and mutual aid, principles utterly incompatible with the totalitarian grip of the North Korean state and so many countries like them. And, of course, you've also got the aforementioned cult of personality as a tool of control. The deification of Kim Jong il mirrored historical authoritarian regimes where where the state manipulates ideology and propaganda to maintain control. So, from my view, this is a form of artificial legitimacy that diverts power from the people to a single ruling figure, reinforcing a cycle of oppression. And you might ask, well, what is a more genuine legitimacy? Well, really, it's actually pretty simple. It's where you have freedom and a relative lack of oppression. When there is less oppression, then you pretty much automatically have more legitimacy. And of course, also like if a government or I suppose any other organization actually lives up to its stated purpose, then you can say, okay, it has some factual legitimacy. So that there's actually a matter of simply if something is actually living up to its own stated standards, and is it actually in accordance with the truth? Is there a factual basis for whatever claims are being made by either the government or corporations or any number of organizations, individually too. You can have oppressive individuals, you can have illegitimate relationships with individuals. They can be abusive, they could in some ways have like a strict military style rule over a family, like if it's a stereotypical patriarchal father, who's abusive in at least some ways to their family. You would have to say that there's an oppressive atmosphere in that household, and that father, or in some cases mother, lacks legitimacy as a serious caretaker over presumably the children in that household. And that brings me to one of the common arguments that I make when it comes to legitimacy. Like what is a legitimate institution? Well, most people agree that a parent or guardian has some legitimacy as a concept, right? Every child needs guidance, of some kind, a positive influence. They need to learn the ways of the world, the alphabet as as an important thing. Presumably you want them to learn some of the basic facts of life. And in order to do that, you need a parent or a guardian. You should have, an education system in place, et cetera, et cetera. But even though we consider parents or guardians to have a legitimate role, we still don't say, oh, a parent should be able to do anything they want to a child. The vast majority of people would recoil in horror if a parent could just do whatever they want. Like if they're sadistic to a child or something like that. I could get into that more, but could get in trouble with demonetization or whatever. I'll just say, we don't encourage parents to be outright abusive toward children, at least if we care about legitimacy and, being humane and, in a lot of cases, just being factual, because abusive people, including abusive parents, are often liars. They'll often lie about it, or they'll come up with some flimsy and often surreal justification for why they're acting the way that they act. And that's true whether it's an individual or, a government system. So, my alternative to all that kind of crap, a sane alternative to the North Korean model or anything quite like it, would involve a decentralized, non hierarchical society where individuals and communities self organize to meet their own needs rather than relying on a hyper oppressive state. So you'd have mutual aid, direct action, and voluntary cooperation. Well, there would be concentration of power between, you know, groups that volunteer. But I meant to say cooperation. But there would be some type of concentrated power within those groups. That's just how organizations go. They have some degree of power. Um, but those types of legitimate organizations would replace forced obedience and state control. I won't even go so far as to say the state would be abolished, but at the very least, it would be minimized, and there would be a lot of uh, restrictions on what the state or any other organization could actually do, and the people would actually have more say over how society functions, over how their workplaces function, and all that kind of stuff. So the tragedy of North Korea is a stark reminder of what happens when absolute power is concentrated in the hands of a few rather than distributed among the many. And no society is perfect, but there's always room for some improvement. And it's hard to improve anything when you're under a dictatorship, as I think a lot of people have found out over the years. And unfortunately, that ball seems to keep rolling. And unfortunately, also, it rolls over the population like a steamroller.